So next up is an initiative very near and dear to my heart because I helped bring the idea to life last year, and we have two powerhouse journalists on the stage right now, and I mean that. Beatrice Forman and Jaisal Noor to discuss Democracy Day, which you should all be a part of. If you leave here and you don't join Democracy Day, I'm going to send you a nastygram. We got to have you on our team. So, Beatrice, Jaisal, floor is all yours.
All right. Okay. Oh, we went backwards. Fun. Okay. Hi. Stephanie said, my name is Beatrice Forman, and I am the program coordinator of Democracy Day, and I'm also a breaking news reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Hi, I'm Jaisal Noor. I am Democracy Cohort Manager at Solutions Journalism Network and also an organizer with U.S. Democracy Day.
So today we're going to be talking about how Democracy Day came together last year, literally from a Twitter thread, and how we're building towards covering the 2024 presidential election and hopefully bringing you guys along with us. So to set the stage for today, we're going to kind of set the stakes, set the table. Democracy is slipping in the United States, even if you don't realize it. We're going to be talking about Democracy Day's lore and origin story. We're going to be giving you guys some 3 low-lift tips to implement into your newsroom's municipal government, government accountability, or elections coverage in hopes that you will join Democracy Day, or if you don't, you still get a helpful tip and trick, and then how to participate in Democracy Day. So I'm going to pass this over to my colleague now.
So quick survey. Who here has heard of Democracy Day? Raise your hand.
Oh, we love to see it.
Yes, we have a good captive audience here. Awesome. So as if you are here, you are most likely well aware of the threats that are facing our democracy and the role that the media has played in helping create some of those threats, but what it can do to also respond to those threats is central to this discussion we are having. And right in the center of that is the role the media plays, whether it considers democracy a spectator sport that is between 2 political parties and requires people to go to the ballot box every couple years and cast a ballot, has come under increasing scrutiny. And that role also limits our imaginations on what the public's role can be and the press's role can be. And this idea of Democracy Day really came forward to support that, explore that idea, and to learn from our past mistakes as journalists. So what is pro-democracy reporting? Pro-democracy reporting is the antidote to the problems with democracy, the both-sidesing of issues we've seen journalists do. It's rooted in the belief the media is empowered by the First Amendment and that democratic participation is sacred, and we can't shrug our shoulders or be neutral when these principles come under attack. And we shouldn't aspire to be neutral or unbiased on that idea of the First Amendment or democracy. Democracy is not a game, and the media's role should be to hold those accountable that seek to infringe on our democratic rights, spread disinformation, and instead give people the information they need to be active participants in democracy and exercise democratic power, rights, and responsibilities. And we also know through our work at Solutions Journalism Network, and that many of you have been involved in, is that just talking about the threats to democracy is not enough. And in fact, it can have the opposite effect of what that intends if you just focus on the problem. We have to be talking about what people can do and what people are doing to respond to that. And there's often what I would call a false binary that says, and I've talked to journalists that might even agree with the argument I just made, but say, hey, we have to, at the end of the day, our outlet has to get views, we have to get clicks, we have to get subscribers, and the idea is the only way to do that is through by exploiting the negativity bias, by focusing on what's wrong in the world, because we know our brains are hardwired we're drawn to that. But there's increasing research and impacts from the Advancing Democracy Fellowship, which is a collaboration between Harkin, SJN, Trusting News, and we also work with Pointer and Good Conflict to really help newsrooms become truly pro-democracy. And we saw one community newsroom in La Salle Latino, had tremendous impacts leading up to the 2012 election last year. 300% increase in page views by using these values, by being pro-democracy, by engaging with their audience. And there's some more numbers up there, but the Texas Tribune, which is not a small community newsroom, they surpassed their views on their election coverage from the 2020 election in their 2022 voter guide based on these principles of engaging, on focusing on solutions, and being transparent with their audience. A little bit about U.S. Democracy Day's origin story, and some of the folks are in the room right now. So shout out to Rachel Glickhouse, who, responding to a column by Margaret Sullivan in the Washington Post that was outlining the dangers that media faces in repeating its past mistakes in the upcoming elections last year, and I think it was January of last year, understanding that change doesn't come from editorial pages or people on Twitter, had the idea of getting people together and actually starting a movement to support these values. And we're all here because we know that collective power is essential to tackling these problems, and so that's what Democracy Day sought out to do. Quickly, that Twitter thread that you see up on the screen, snowballed into like a small volunteer army. This year we have funding, and we made some tremendous impacts over the last year and a half in really sort of championing the idea of a pro-democracy media movement. So nearly 400 newsrooms participated last year on September 15th, which is the International Day of Democracy. And participation just involves publishing a story, or it could be resharing a story about that principle of having a pro-democracy newsroom, not only talking about the threats to democracy in a clear way, but also what can be done to fight them. Newsrooms started democracy beats, and we have a advisory board with some fantastic journalists, and we have a lot more in store for you this year.
Yeah. So you heard about what Democracy Day did with like $1, a dream, and a Twitter thread and a group of volunteers. So here's what we're doing now that we have funding, which is so exciting. So the first thing we did, like Jaisal mentioned, was they appointed an advisory board, which includes Jean Sun, who gave keynote today, and they also hired me, which was super cool because I wanted a side hustle. But beyond that, we kind of have 3 tent poles guiding our work in reimagining Democracy Day. The first is helping newsrooms build infrastructure to cover the 2024 election more meaningfully. So that includes staffing up, hiring, sustaining, budgeting for a democracy beat, creating audience engagement campaigns and tools to make your reporting more transparent and understandable to the people and the audiences you're serving, and also kind of tips and tricks to frame stories in a way that really empower and enfranchise voters. We're also diversifying our core of newsrooms, so to speak, and tackling new mediums. If you're familiar with the project or participated, from last year that a lot of our newsrooms were hyperlocal or local outlets with kind of a digital or traditional print focus. This year we're trying to shift over to broadcast television and broadcast radio outlets. So if you work for one of those or involved in one, we'd love to hear from you. And the last thing is we're really, really focused on community building this year. And what that means is being in community with Democracy Day's organizers, but also being in community with the other newsrooms participating, because there is so much to learn from every single newsroom. They're all doing something amazing with different constraints and goals. So we're hosting some webinars, which I'll talk more about. There's going to be a blog full of success stories from last year's participants about how they put stuff together on compressed timelines, all that good stuff. And we're hoping to also work towards some in-person events and even a newsletter. So yeah, that's my job to figure out. But in case you're on the fence about Democracy Day, want to join, don't know what to do, here are some kind of 3 low-lift tips you can implement literally tomorrow in your newsroom as you're reporting election or government accountability stories or assigning and editing them. So the first thing is to use a democracy frame, not a partisan frame. This definition comes from Shannon McGregor at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at UNC, and it establishes democracy as both a norm and a prefigurative idea in the US, something we hold dear but are also always striving to uphold and perfect and make better. So what that looks like in terms of how you're doing reporting is it's not just fact-checking election fraud claims, but it's going that extra step to explain how election fraud claims counteract the norms of a democracy, that you accept election results, you certify election results, all of that good stuff. And kind of see this in practice. Here's kind of taking a not so great, we want to throw it out in the garbage headline, and talking about some better ones. So the one up top, it paints election fraud claims as or combating them as an inherently Democratic Party issue. And you don't see the voter, you don't see the larger system at hand. It has a competitive framework. But the ones below really set the stakes. The first one literally talks about the threats to democracy explained. And while admittedly that one, there's some analysis, that's technically an opinion article, there's some ranking, there's some editorializing, the other 2 follow a very hard news framework, and the best way to do that, if you're trying to have a more holistic framing in your headline, is to name the norm that's being violated. So in that first one from CNN, the norm is that election workers shouldn't get harassed at the polls. Now they are. And the second one from ProPublica, that's a double whammy. Not only is the norm of election results getting certified not being upheld in some places, also the regular societal norm of when you don't do your job, you're held accountable to some extent, is also not happening. So it's really important to be upfront and kind of signal those things. The next one is to focus on the stakes and not the odds. So unfortunately, focusing on the odds is kind of the de facto norm in the typical US newsroom. That's horse race coverage, right? It uses a competitive framework where elections are competitions and politicians and the dominant parties are teams. And what that kind of does is trivialize how politics impacts the everyday person, but also how it impacts systems writ large. It's super episodic, which means if you're a regular person who works a job, has to raise a family, has hobbies, has a busy or fulfilling life, you're not going to be able to see those patterns and how things are changing and how movements are forming. You're not going to be the most informed person at the polls if we continue down this path. And also, horse race coverage and focusing on the odds really atomizes newsrooms and atomizes campaigns and acts like they exist in vacuums, when in reality we know the work of one campaign, one politician, one policy in one state influences another. So you want to focus on the stakes, which treat the live narrative of politics, where every politician, every campaign, every policy is contributing to kind of this meta narrative of what democracy is in America and how strong or weak it is. So you want to think about constantly telling a story, not just focusing on single bits of campaigns or politics in your neck of the woods. This is inherently thematic. It makes it easier for readers, viewers, listeners to understand how things are changing over time. And it also is really a good way to, in the moment, say, hey, maybe a movement is forming, or hey, things are changing. Hindsight is obviously 2020, maybe that's a pun, whatever. But we don't always want to have to, look backwards. We want to be able to look forward and name things as they are in the moment. We're going to see headlines on the left. Again, not too great. Maybe want to throw them in the trash because they use an inherently competitive framework, right? It's about winning or losing in terms of redistricting, which makes redistricting and redlining like a map. But in reality, there are real voters at play who are being more or less enfranchised. So you want headlines that really point to the stakes and the impacts. So the other one of them from New Yorker is about redistricting. It says it's threatening democracy. The other ones point to the clear consequences of, the election denier movement, so to speak, right? They're getting elected, they're changing how politics are done in states like Arizona, right? You want to have headlines that are clear and explanatory and really set the table for your reader. And the final one, which you are all probably super good at recognizing, is avoiding bothsidesism, which is just another fun way of saying a false equivalency, right? It's giving two sides the same space, weight, and merit in an article where maybe one doesn't deserve it. And I think in journalism, we're often coached into doing this in the name of fairness. But I think as we're learning, fairness is not always accurate, and fairness is not always just. And I think when the stakes are this high, when we're seeing a lot of democratic norms and kind of just like ways society operates backsliding here, you gotta go a bit beyond fairness. So one of the common false equivalencies is, right, like climate change deniers versus science. And we know how to recognize that. We're doing a better job as an industry of not giving, flat earthers as big as a platform as like Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? But when we're looking at elections, that gets a little bit different. You kind of want to cede more so to results over claims from election deniers. I think it's really dangerous to give people an unfettered platform to say that without being checked in the moment, like the Donald Trump, CNN town hall, like even like the Nikki Haley town hall, where they're saying all of these things that can like create a movement around anti-democratic norms, and they're not being checked. And the other one also, right, in a bit more of a socio-political situation, is a book ban, and you want to give the curriculum and what's actually going on in school a bit more weight than people who, we read these reports. They're not reading the whole book. They're reading spark notes. They're not engaging and doing their due diligence. So you want to keep those in mind when you're writing articles, to not also platform the misconception or the false claim, because what that will do with a reader or listener is it plants it in their head, especially if it's towards the end of the article because of recency bias, and they'll remember that, but not the fact-checking or the good reporting around it, which is why this balance and avoiding bothsidesism is so crucial. So, now, if you like what you heard, here's kind of a roadmap to participating in Democracy Day. So if you're like super jazzed about it, and we hope you are, we're trying our darndest to get you jazzed, you should fill out the form that is linked in this presentation. Just commit your newsroom to participating. And what does a commitment look like? Most of you know, but it's actually really simple. You are committing yourself, if you're a freelancer, or your newsroom to reporting one democracy-related story out on or before the International Day of Democracy, which is September 15th. But this year, since we're focusing on infrastructure, you can also create and launch a piece of like newsroom infrastructure or a workflow related to elections reporting, government reporting, by September 15th. So that could be posting a job listing for a democracy beat, posting a reporting FAQ that explains how the ways in which your newsroom covers politics and what stories you do and don't take on. You can also do things like that. Truly a choose your own adventure. The other thing is you can also attend some of our webinars, which are open to everybody in the journalism community, not just Democracy Day participants. We have one coming up with the Objective, which is about funding how to fund a democracy reporting position in your newsroom and sustain it. And we have another with the lovely folks at Trusting News about how to create a reporting FAQ. And finally, we are going to have some resources coming out. Two are available today in hard copies, one of which is a checklist for reporters full of prompting questions to ask sources when reporting stories on election integrity, municipal politics, municipal government, government accountability, all of that good stuff. The other is a checklist for editors to keep in mind certain frames as you're assigning and editing stories. So raise your hand if you would like a hard copy to look at right now and keep with you as a souvenir. Oh, wow. Keep your hands nice and high. We're going to be passing them around. Allende, Shaga Allende. Woo. And if you're more of a digital person or you lose things like I do, We have a lovely QR code that you can scan and will take you to a link tree with all of the resources for Democracy Day, including our website, our Twitter, our contact information, registration forms for our collaborative, but also for our webinars and resources, all that good stuff. Anything you want to add?
We'll have, so Democracy Day is going to be commissioning stories that newsrooms are free to share and compiling other stories that you, as participants in Democracy Day, are free to republish and use on your own websites.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people's participation last year just counted as republishing, which I think is really, really important.
It's a true collaborative spirit.
Very true. All right, we have about 10 minutes left for questions. So keep your hands raised if you want a handout, but feel free to come up to the mic and ask some questions.
Hello, Alex Howard. I was a participant in Democracy Day, so thank you so much for organizing this. It was cool to see that it was organized on Twitter, so maybe that contradicts the idea that things on Twitter don't matter. Mm-hmm. I would argue that social media, in fact, has been a corrective to a lot of the problems in mainstream and legacy media institutions, where people who didn't have a voice before could then bear witness to what was happening in their communities and report with people. So just that's the question as a comment, because you're here in D.C. The question for you, though, is actually the hard one I've really been struggling with. I was a deputy director of a transparency organization and advocate, Sunlight Foundation. We did a lot of collaborative journalism with people all around the world. And when the last administration came in and took a deliberately anti-democratic approach, we were then portrayed as partisan. And I thought that your tip about keeping partisanship out of your headlines and out of your coverage was very powerful, because people, I think, believe in democracy. But if you're reporting upon the greatest threat to democracy in the United States today, that's far-right authoritarianism. How do you give feedback, guidance, support, and tips to newsrooms that want to be independent and nonpartisan, to be accurate, to be honest about that threat without alienating the people they need to bring in to the coverage?
So that's a great question, and that is a really central question that you hear a lot in these discussions, right? Is being pro-democracy mean being pro-democratic party? And my answer is no, because you're holding both parties to the same standards. You're not applying one standard differently to one party or the other. You're evaluating the decisions, the actions, the impacts of the policies, regardless of who is in power, what administration. You cannot be afraid to criticize either political party, either major political party, and you're really focusing on the impacts of those policies. Like, for example, in much of the media coverage of the debt limit, again, you saw that it was portrayed as a battle between these two parties, when what was missing often in those headlines is the impact of the millions of people whose lives would be directly affected and were directly affected by those policy decisions.
So I have two things to say. I think a lot of times when thinking about pro-democracy coverage, we fall into this trap of it has to be enterprise, it has to be investigatory, it has to be this blue chip thing. But a lot of it is just service journalism that reminds folks that there are different ways to participate in democracy. So that could be something as simple as holding an event that tells regular, everyday citizens that they can file FOIA requests. It can be like something I found really powerful was last year, Resolve held a sound off in a part of Philadelphia called Mantua that was just about how to ask questions to politicians at a town hall, right? That's pro-democracy coverage. It's literally empowering people. It could also be explaining what a county commissioner does or an election commissioner does, like how a polling or voting machine works. It's things like that. It doesn't have to be explicitly investigative. It can just be stuff that people need to know to participate in democracy at its full complement. And I think the other way to kind of push back at claims of being partisan is explaining your reporting process. I think the reason why so many claims of the media being leftist or liberal really bubble up and hold some level of clout on the internet from the far right is because a lot of our practices are so opaque and we're not good at explaining what we do to people. So something I think is really awesome, right? New York Times is doing those enhanced bylines where it can explain how a story comes together. So if you're doing that blue chip investigation on issues of accountability in your government or something, maybe say, like, we did this by looking through X many documents and talking to X many people and kind of showing how your process comes together so people at least know that if they don't agree with the thesis of the article or they don't agree with the outcome of it, they know that you did your work and were confident enough in it to explain how it came together. Any other questions?
And did that answer your question? If you have a question,
Yeah,
please
just come up to the mic.
Hi. Is there a way that you can spread the word to, so I understand that this is important work of organizing newsrooms and recruiting newsrooms to participate. Is there a way to put this in front of members of the public to get them to ask their newsrooms and demand this of newsrooms that serve their communities to say, this is what we want you to do, this is important to us, we want democracy coverage?
Well, that's my job, so
Yeah.
there can be. We're gonna obviously have social media outlets, social media assets and stuff available later in the summer as things ramp up. I'm also working with one of our advisory board members on an ambassador program for civil society and civic engagement org. So they will, get a media kit to kind of share Democracy Day, encourage their local media ecosystem to participate, and also do their own events in tandem. So that stuff is in the works.
Awesome.
Yeah, and reach out to your local paper or whatever publications you subscribe to, and ask if you don't see your outlet as a sponsor of Democracy Day or as someone that is signed up, ask them why. What about this did they disagree with? And we have tons of resources to share with you.
And if they're not answering you, you can ask me, and I will send a lot more, aggressively polite email asking them to join.
Hi, I'm Angie Holan. I'm editor-in-chief of PolitiFact. I wanted to ask you about what are your thoughts, and this is a complicated topic, on pro-democracy messaging on Twitter, because it seems like it's increasingly not a safe space for some individual journalists, and there is basically increasing authoritarian activity on the platform. I was curious how you see that in the whole mix of activities around Democracy Day.
I think Jaisal probably has something better to say, but I think there's a balance between it not being a safe space for journalists and also being where people are. I think the average person who interacts with Twitter doesn't really understand how bad or how dangerous Elon Musk's is. It doesn't really notice or care or think about what the trust and safety team leaving means. It still was pretty much the same platform for them, maybe with a little bit more curse words and porn on it. So I think we have to keep in mind that two things can be true. It cannot be the safest space for journalists, but also where a general interest audience is, and that there still is a compelling reason to be there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would just add that that's a decision that every newsroom and journalist needs to make, and I can't use all the words I want to describe the state of Twitter right now. I hardly ever use it anymore. I log on it once a day. I found it to be increasingly harmful for my own mental health, just like what my feed looks like. So I totally understand that decision, and that's a discussion that journalists should have with their colleagues, that newsrooms should be having right now.
It's really about seeing who your audience is. I think it would be easier for a more niche publication to be like, okay, whatever, screw it, we move over to Mastodon or Post or someplace else because that's where our audience is. But if you're I don't know, case in point, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and you have to serve a whole city that has a major digital divide, I don't think you can afford to not be on a platform that big, that captures such a large audience size, especially around an election. So maybe you could, not encourage, certain journalists to post on there, or say you're not required to have an online presence in that way, but your news organization maintains its, formerly verified account.
Thank you.
Hi, Alice Drager, founder and now reporter at East Lansing Info in East Lansing, Michigan. So you know Michigan, the crazy uncle
You
state.
have 30 seconds. Sorry.
So I just wanted to share with you a really quick story and to encourage people doing local news to go after local election denying stories, because I think at the national level, people get with their news, whether it's the left or the right, they're not getting the actual stories. We did a story on an election denier telling us that there was a voter who voted, her name was supposedly Emily Dickinson, and she supposedly lived at a local bar. And so we looked into it, and my reporting team was terrified of looking into this, that we in fact would find a case of voter fraud, and we would become national as a case proving voter fraud. There was a young woman named Emily Dickinson, and the reason she was registered at the bar is because she lived in a brand new apartment building, which was not yet given an address, essentially, in the voting system. So when that happens, you're supposed to register at the nearest address, which happened to be the bar next door. So we were able to bring that story, and I think it had a real impact locally on the people who were giving into election denialism, because they were able to see a real story in our town where we checked a case, and we fearlessly checked that case, or we hid the fear, and then we brought it forward. So thank you.
That is an awesome comment, and right, it also, please clap. It also demystifies a bit of the election process and voting process and arcana, right? New developments are being built every day. What happens if you do move into a place that's midway through construction and you want to vote, right? Sometimes thinking about and reporting on those edge cases or worst case scenarios or, what ifs is really, really important too.
And I would just end on a note that the Texas Tribune, that was part of the Advancing Democracy Fellowship last year, they did a story like that, but then they also reached out to the denier and explained to them what they thought they saw or what they thought they read, and explained why it was false. So you can complete the circle, and that is really powerful journalism. Thank you for sharing that.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. Join Democracy Day. Join Democracy Day. All right. Thanks, Beatrice. Thanks, Jaisal.